I'm going to be talking about today the two perhaps most important topographic asymmetries in the Middle East that is driving the Arab-Israeli conflict as well as the Sunni-Shia conflict. And to my right, to your left, is my topographic map of Israel. And to over here is I have a topographic map of the Middle East. Now what I want everyone to understand is what EMET and what my presentation is all about is really bringing information to people in a clear way that then they can process the information relatively simply. And so I have one more map, which is a small topographic map of Israel. And if any staffer wants me to send this to them so that they can borrow it, so just to have it in the office to show their congressman or whatever for a little while, just contact Sarah or me, and we'll send it to you so you can look at it in the cool, calm recesses of your office and show your staffers or other congressmen or whatever. Okay, so with no further ado, what I want to first show you is this blue grab bag that I handed out. There are 4 things in this little grab bag. The first is this colorful handout, and this is sort of what I'm going to be talking from today. And if everyone could get this out, this is really going to be the roadmap to my talk. Okay? That's going to be the roadmap to my talk. The second is what I would have loved to have had up on the screen, but I'm gonna turn it off because I tried my best, and my best is not good enough to get this thing working. I had it working, but do that as it may, I don't need that for the presentation. It would have just been a little bit more elaborate. Okay, what is the spiral bound is really a briefing book. Now what I mean by a briefing book is everything I'm going, and this is a color briefing book. You guys got black and white because it's do this at my own cost. And it's a little too expensive to color for everybody. But what I did do is I have a disc which has the color version on the disc. So what you could do is just take it, download it to your iPad, and voila, you've got everything that I was going to show on the screen, but you've got everything on an iPad that you can send to people and use or just look at, and it's a very handy thing. So with no further ado, I'll get into the real heart of the matter, which, so the third thing I'm going to talk about today, the first is the topography of Israel, the second is the topography of the Persian Gulf, and the third is the nuclear issue. I was going to introduce the general notion of the nuclear issue, and then Clara was going to further that, but we'll see how that goes. So first of all, the key is, if you look at this front page, the most often commented thing when someone sees my map is they go, oh, well, this is the West Bank, which they point to the side of the river over here. And I say, yeah, that is the West Bank, but that's not the West Bank we know and love. The West Bank we know and love is, and by the way, when I say West Bank, I really do not mean anything degrading Judean Samaria or vice versa. That's the term I use. So the West Bank is really this green line that extends through what is really a mountain, a small mountain range from the north of the West Bank through the spine of the West Bank down to the Negev. And here you see Jerusalem. It's like a little finger sticking out over here. And so the West Bank is really not just the West Bank. It's actually a rather significant gradient mountain range. Just to give you everybody perspective, this is the Golan Heights up here. Now, what I do is I take this little blue patch and I put it on over here so that you can understand that underneath this blue patch is 70% of Israel's Jewish population and 80% of her industrial base. So all of a sudden, you're not seeing a rather homogeneous distribution. You've got a huge crown jewel of your population here with a mountain range over here. What I often say is that they named it the wrong name. They should have named it the West Heights. Because if they named it the West Heights, I mean, this is much more threatening to 4 million people than even the Golan Heights, relatively speaking. So you just get an idea of what it would mean. Now, how does the fact that you have this topography, how is that the driver, or in many ways the key aspect of the conflict? Well, let me give you an example. In my little briefing book over here, the first page of the briefing book is a page from the CIA World Factbook. And it's not the exact page because I spliced some stuff, but it's the actual page from the CIA World Factbook. And I boxed in something here. And I'm going to read it to you. Highlands, it's under geography. Highlands, meaning the Sumerian highlands. This is Samaria and this is Judea. The Sumerian highlands are main recharge area for Israel's coastal aquifers. Now, what is that? What does that mean? Well, it means something very simple. Forget about the West Bank, forget about anything. Let's say this is the roof of a house. Okay? This is the roof of a house. If water falls on the roof, what happens? Water goes to the side, and if there's no gutter, it falls off the side. Well, that is exactly what is going on in the West Bank. If I may, what I want you to do is forget looking at it like this for a second, and look at it instead like this for a second. Look at the cross-section. Okay? Now that cross-section, I posit, sort of echoes this cross-section that I just showed you. So now, if you, in your mind's eye, look at this is the Jordan Valley, this is the crest running north, and this is the green line, and you look at my graphic that I have on the first page, you'll see that why is the CIA saying something that's truthful? Because of the topography. And the key point is that the water falls in the West Bank and goes to pre-67 Israel. So one of the key problems that is often not discussed and neglected is if Israel were to return to 1967 border and there is no policing mechanism for Israel to be able to remove illegal wells, then Israel would be deprived of about over 50% of its water. Because not only do you have the West Bank water going to pre-67 Israel, underneath pre-67 Israel, you have saltwater intrusion from the Mediterranean. So right now, there's this like little battle going on. Salt water is pushing in, and the fresh water is pushing out. If this fresh water were taken out, the entire coastal aquifer would be salinated. Now, there's another key point here in the CIA briefing book. it says environment, current issues, adequacy of fresh water supply, and sewerage treatment. Now, what are they talking about when they say sewage treatment? They're talking about something very important, in that the Palestinians, the international community, and this building has given millions and millions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority to build water sewage treatment plants for the exact reason that when you look at this, if you have a Palestinian housing over here and they flush their toilets, what happens? Refuse water goes downhill the same way fresh water goes down. Okay? I call it jihad by toilet. Bottom line is, they have been offered money to build sewage treatment plants, and they steadfastly have refused, except for one very small treatment plant. And there's millions and millions and millions available, but they're refusing to do it. So now, could you imagine after you have some type of removal of Israeli forces? Now, in the briefing book, I will just draw your attention to one additional thing, actually two additional things, and then I'll move on to the next issue. I have, one of my resources is a recent report from the Israeli government called the Civil Administration of Judea and Samaria. In this report, you can find it on page 23. In here, and this is a very, very great resource, and if anyone has any questions, call me or Sarah, and we'll send you more information on the water issue. But here it says, the unapproved wells are all located in areas that flow westward. The illegal wells thus cut, and this is today, this report was issued like a couple months ago. The illegal wells thus cut off the flow before the water can reach Israel. This has an impact on Israeli wells in Israel, as not enough water is reaching them. Meaning there is a whole agreement on water issues that at this very moment the Palestinians are violating. And this is an Israeli government document, it's not a Langfan or EMET document. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. Now, one final point I want to make, which is on page, and just as an aside, the real key issue here is, how can you guys help? How can this building help this problem? It's very simple. So you say, listen, there is not going to be a penny of any money being dispersed until the Palestinians are forced to actually build the water sewage treatment plants that they've been given money to actually build. Okay? But as a point, this point is why I use the water issue almost as the paradigm for the peace process. On page 81, no, on page 26, I'm sorry, I have an article from the Washington Post. Now, what is this article? The article's titled, "In Gaza, Hamas rule has not turned out as many as expected." Okay? But this ain't talking about how it's expected towards the Jews. I'm going to read you the one sentence that's the key point here. The water barrels pledged by municipal authorities seem to go only to Hamas cadres. Well, gee whiz. Okay? What has happened? In fact, the only thing that has been, the only people who have gotten more water are the people by the name of Hamas who have the biggest guns. And in fact, one of the issues that is at the core of corruption in the Palestinian Authority is the extraction of money from Palestinians who have it in return for water. And that's part of what Khalid Abu Tomeh is writing about when he's talking about corruption, and when he's just been banned off Facebook for talking about Palestinian corruption. This is what it's about. And it is an anti-intuitive, crazy thing that what we've done is just on the water issue, we've empowered the most brutal parts of the Palestinians to exert a terrible, terrible force against its own people. Okay, now, so issue number one, water. Issue number two, what I want everyone to do is turn, oh, and just as an aside, if you turn to the inside page of this color, you'll see what I've done is I've really given you an ability to show someone else this topographic scene. Meaning if you look at that next page, you can sort of, you're viewing it right from here. And you're looking down and looking up the Jordan Valley. Because this is a Jordan Valley. This is where the Jordan River, and this is the East Bank. This is Jordan. But now, we're going to go to what Sarah was talking about a little earlier, the rockets from Gaza. If everyone can turn to this next page that has the rockets, that would be great. What I've done is I've taken a relatively new map from the IDF and I've put it against another map by Global Security. And why I did this was because you see the various ranges of the rockets that they were firing, that people that Hamas was firing, or whomever. Okay? And the key point is this is a human man over here. And the reason why I've done that is because I want people to see the size of the rockets relative to the size of the man. Now why? Well, first, just to get an idea, in a rough sense, that a rocket about yay high, my height, if this is the range, meaning if I put this up here, it's 12 miles and 20 kilometers. From this point here, what they've been firing is these rockets, essentially mostly north, but a little bit east, just hit a road. And the rockets on average go this far. Now, yes, if you look at this, you can see some of the rockets, the 122s, they have an improved version that goes even further. And then they have this huge, really big rocket, this Fahir, that goes even, but this is 2 tons. This weighs a heck of a lot. You're not going to have some terrorist running out into a field with this thing. You really need a big truck. So these are relatively easy. I mean, it's not relatively easy. I'm not the person who's trying to pinpoint this thing and fire it from a helicopter. But these big rockets are relatively easy to see moving. But these smaller rockets are very compact and portable and can fire. So if we just sort of say the middle rockets, the grad is what I'm talking about here, fires about this far. Now the reason why I bring this rocket up is not just to inform you that they're firing these rockets. Okay? What I'm aiming at is the most often hypothesized solution to the Arab-Israeli, Palestinian and Israeli conflict is what is called a demilitarized Palestinian state. Now, in my view, a demilitarized Palestinian state is a hoax. Okay? And why is it a hoax? Because, number one, you do not have a situation like between North Korea and South Korea where there's almost no people in this zone. We're always told there are 2 million Palestinians here that are bringing things in and out. Okay? And the same way goods can be smuggled into the Gaza Strip, and the pieces to these rockets can be smuggled into the Gaza Strip. That same exact way of smuggling rockets in, if there is a Palestinian demilitarized state here with no Israeli border guards, no Israeli internal security, and no Israeli control, military control over the borders and everything else here, they can smuggle these same type of rockets into this area, and they go the same distance. Okay? Now you got to ask yourself a question. Wait a second. Haven't the Israeli generals thought about this? Well, this is the key. They have. And you want to know part, and I'll get to Iron Dome in a second. Okay. What does the Israeli general say to this? The Israeli general says, oh, we'll reinvade the whole West Bank. Now, if anyone here thinks that that is even a remote possibility, that's a little bit shocking. Okay. But just to give you an idea, they fired about 15,000 of these rockets, and not many people have been killed. Well, again, you have almost no population around the Gaza Strip. It's like firing a rocket from here into North Dakota. And I don't want anyone from North Dakota or South Dakota to take under it. Except, the point is, it's almost empty. Okay, so what are your chances of hitting something? Almost zero. However, if you have an Al-Qaeda firing a rocket from Brooklyn to Manhattan, what are you talking about? Okay, that's what I'm talking about. And not only do these rockets fire, you can see the damage they do, okay, on that back page. But I just give, for edification's sake, a little bit more of what these rockets do in the briefing book. And to give you an idea, they have these little things called ball bearings, because they have different types of warheads. These little ball bearings here, the size of a pencil thing. And what happens is these rockets fall, and the ball bearings go. Okay, so could you imagine one of these going in Midtown Manhattan, or in Ben Gurion Airport that's located right over here? It's a no-go. So that is the situation with Israel and the West Bank. Now I'm going to briefly talk about another subject that's dear to our hearts, which is the Persian Gulf. And here, I want everyone to understand that Persia was an empire for a very, very good reason. They didn't have to build a wall. This is Persia, or Iran. And you see, it's really virtually a fortress. It is rung with huge mountains, especially on its western aspect. To give you an idea, these mountains top out at about 4,500 meters. The Rockies are barely 4,100 meters. They go up to that in about 100 or so miles. The key difference is when you're looking at Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other is totally flat. So you really have a total asymmetry of the topography. But now we're going to get to something that is, and I have that diagrammatized and pictured on this. Again, when you're looking at this map, you sort of have to imagine looking in on this angle. But now, why is this all so important? Okay. This is the. If there's one point in this talk, it's what I'm about to show you. Actually, two things I'm about to show you, but. So, on the internet, you can find a map, and this is in your briefing book, and it's in your handout. Okay, this is a map off the internet that shows all the oil and gas in the Middle East. And this is the amazing thing about this thing. You think Saudi Arabia has got all this oil and gas? No. Saudi Arabia has got all of this oil and gas only in this eastern province. The rest of Saudi Arabia's got nothing. Same thing with Iran. You look at this whole big country of Iran. Where's the oil? Oh, there's a little bit up there, but that's not really the key. All the oil is in the Persian Gulf. Iraq, all the oil is in up here. And then there's this little bit in Syria. So what I did to dramatize that aspect was make another map. And all I did was I took that first map and I put a little triangle on it. And lo and behold, this little triangle, maybe 150, 200 miles times 500 miles this way, has got all of the oil, or almost all, it's not perfect, but it's darn near close to it, of all the oil that's sitting right here. Now, what this means is Iran does not have to invade the entire Saudi Arabia to get 90 to 100% of all Saudi Arabia's oil. All it has to do is just go to the coastline, just sort of like a Saddam Hussein not stopping at Kuwait, okay? And now I got one more graphic for you to make even the situation more complicated. There's another map by the same cartographer where he showed the ethnic distribution. And in fact, this is the Shia population. And you see the Shia population is exactly over the oil in Saudi Arabia. So you have all of these undercurrents of issues that are intimately related in the topography. Now I'm going to get to another point about Awaz in a second, but I now want to talk about the nuclear issue for a little bit. How am I doing in time?
Just a few more minutes. And
more minutes? Okay. Okay.
And Ken also has a few things to contribute.
Okay, so everybody, I have an advertisement. There is a certain section of the Intelligence Authorization Act. And this section is called Section 721. And it's in your briefing materials. And I'm just going to make 2 more points. It is from this Section 721 that I derived this map, this graph. And it's in your briefing materials on page 113. And what this Section 721 is really the open source Bible for people like me. Meaning, where am I going to get the exact amounts of uranium hexafluoride that can be relied upon? Well, it just so happens that the Congress had the wisdom to pass a law that every year the defense establishment has to give the exact amounts that they think Iran and other certain countries have. And it's an open source, unclassified version. And believe it or not, the Congress is actually thinking of repealing Section 721. Okay? So I beg every person here to reconsider and go and look at this and say, is this something we want to repeal? It would be an absolute catastrophe. Why?
No, why is it a catastrophe? Why is it?
I'll tell you why. This is their argument. Oh, we have so many reporting requirements. Okay. Now, to be honest with you, the IAEA does come up with reports, but it's so easy for the CIA to just look at the IAEA report and say, yeah, that looks approximately this. It's something deeper. Okay, if you look at when, in 2008, Iran had zero uranium hexafluoride, U-235, 0. All of a sudden, since 2009, so what this graph in fact shows is the provenance, not of uranium, it shows on whose watch the Iranian enriched uranium was enriched on. And for this to be repealed would be an absolute catastrophe. But now one more issue, and then I'll throw it over to Claire. Why is any of this important? Why is Israel important? Why is the West Bank important? Why is it a strategic value? Well, many years ago, I was in numerous congressional offices, and you see me as you see me. And I'd have a congressman look at me, a pro-Israel congressman look at me dead in the face and say, listen, now I understand why the West Bank is important for Israel, but you got to help me on something. Why is Israel important for me? 20 years ago, I had congressmen telling me that their constituents were saying Israel's an apartheid state. We shouldn't spend the $3 billion on Israel. It's a destabilizing force in the scheme of things. It's the cause of all the Middle East problems. That's what I explain to me, he said. So I said, okay. So I came up with this map that's in your materials to explain it. And I just have a simple thing. First, I put the countries that are surrounding Israel. That's all I do. And then I make the simple posit that I just showed you with Katyusha rockets. And by the way, the same way Katyusha rockets, you can screw the top off and put ball bearings. You can screw the top off and put chemical weapons. Now, if anybody thinks that's not accurate, in the briefing book you see James says exactly what I said. So, all I do is I put, and I just say, okay, if what I'm saying is true, and if what Abba Ibn, who said the 1967 borders or Auschwitz borders was true, that God forbid something happens to Israel. Now, aren't we going to get peace and tranquility? Well, let's look at that. God forbid a million times something happens to Israel. What's going to likely happen? Let's just keep Jordan out of the mix for a second. You're going to get a little bit of a bigger Syria / Hezbollah / whatever there is, the terrorist du jour, okay, up there. And you're going to get a little bit of a bigger Egypt. Egypt said it wants Jerusalem as its capital. Okay. Now, is Lebanon an independent state? Has it ever been an independent state? Maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Not an independent state for the past 40 years. Are you going to all of a sudden have all of these occupying powers say, yeah, let's have a beautiful independent Palestine and move on? Not exactly. Step number 2. Israel has been protecting Jordan for the past 50 years. So, without Israel protecting Jordan, well, Jordan's not there now. So, without Israel's protective umbrella, forget about it. I've been doing this for 20 years. No one, but no one, could ever, there's nothing you can't even, there's nothing to say to those two things. Because that's all I need. Because then, all of a sudden, you have Egypt that's got 80 million people. And this is when Mubarak was around. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, my God, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Saudis hate each other. You got 80 million people with a land contiguous border on the northern part of Saudi Arabia, where Egypt is got the strongest conventional army in the Middle East and control of the Suez Canal. How can, are you seeing lower gas prices in Omaha, Nebraska? Not exactly. I've only had one person ever challenge me on this one. They said, oh, no problem. We'll station forces here to protect Saudi Arabia. I said, okay, let's line item that one out. How much is that going to cost? And didn't Osama bin Laden say the whole reason why he attacked the World Trade Center was because you had American infidels on the Holy Land? Okay, so if you look at this, all of a sudden, and by the way, I've studiously left out the Iranian arc here. The real Iranian arc is, God forbid there's no Israel, how are you ever going to get forces to protect the black gold triangle if push comes to shove? Okay? So all of a sudden, you have an intimate integration of these two topographies in a very, very meaningful way for American policymakers. And one more thing, this is what I call Eastern Theater, which is everything to the east of Israel. Lately, I've been given a new one. And this is the last thing I'm going to talk about. This, I call my Western Theater. And by the way, everybody, I have this on. I made like a 4-minute video for this thing. And it's in the materials. So you just, if you download the briefing book on the page, all you have to do is just click it and you get, it's all hyperlinked. Okay? So what I did here was the same thing I did with the other. I said, okay, let's just put the countries around the Eastern Med. And these are the 3 numbers that are important. Turkey, 75 million. Egypt, 80 million. southern Cyprus has 800,000 Christians. And there happens to be a whole ton of oil and gas between southern Cyprus and Israel. I ask the same question. God forbid a million times something happens to Israel. Turkey is already on the northern part of Cyprus to begin with, and Cyprus is not a native country. How is 800,000 Christians of Cyprus going to deal with 150 million people who don't agree that they should be getting that oil and gas to begin with, let alone even exist on there? So what happens is, if Cyprus goes, what you then have is an encroachment into the very heart of Europe. And what you have is you have Greece, which is a core NATO country, being at the very front of this vortex. And so when I'm in an office, I ask a simple question. I say, God forbid something happens to Israel. How many billions, how many hundreds of billions are you going to have to put in years 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the military defense budget to protect a core NATO country? That is, if our obligation to Greece is to protect it from an outside threat, and that we still are abiding by our NATO obligations. So, with that, I have a ton more, but with no further ado, I'll throw it over to Claire, and thank you.